Sarah Martinez pulled her baseball cap lower over her eyes as she settled into seat 14C of Flight 447 from Dallas to Denver. The middle seat wasn't her first choice, but it was the last available ticket on this busy Tuesday afternoon. She tucked her small backpack under the seat in front of her and glanced briefly at the businessman to her left, who was already buried in his laptop, and the elderly woman to her right, who smiled warmly at her. At 34, Sarah had learned to blend into crowds. She wore simple jeans, a plain gray hoodie, and comfortable sneakers, nothing that would draw attention. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and she kept her gaze down as passengers continued boarding around her. This was exactly how she preferred it: anonymous, quiet, invisible. The flight attendant making her way down the aisle was named Jessica Chen, according to her name tag. She had been working for the airline for 8 years and had seen thousands of passengers come and go. Most faces blurred together after a while, but something about the woman in 14C caught her attention. Maybe it was the way Sarah held herself. There was a certain alertness, a way of scanning her surroundings that seemed different from the typical traveler. Jessica continued with her pre-flight safety checks, helping passengers stow their bags and ensuring seatbelts were fastened. The plane was nearly full, carrying 180 passengers on this routine domestic flight. Business travelers, families heading home, college students with oversized backpacks, the usual mix. Yet her eyes kept drifting back to 14C. Sarah stared out the window as the plane began to taxi toward the runway. The Dallas skyline grew smaller in the distance, and she felt the familiar mix of relief and melancholy that came with leaving a place behind. She was heading to Denver for what she told people was a consulting job, though the reality was more complicated. The truth was something she rarely shared with anyone. The elderly woman beside her, whose name tag from a recent church conference read Dorothy, struck up a conversation. "Flying somewhere nice, dear?" she asked with the kind of genuine warmth that made it impossible to ignore. "Just work," Sarah replied politely, offering a small smile. She had perfected the art of being friendly enough to avoid seeming rude, but not so engaging that it invited more questions. "What kind of work do you do?" Dorothy persisted, her blue eyes twinkling with curiosity. Sarah hesitated for just a moment. "I'm in security consulting," she said, which was technically true, though it barely scratched the surface of what her job actually involved. Dorothy nodded approvingly. "Important work, keeping people safe. My late husband was in law enforcement for 30 years. He always said the people who really make a difference are often the ones you never hear about." Something in Dorothy's words made Sarah look at her more carefully. There was a wisdom in the older woman's eyes that suggested she understood more than she was letting on. But before Sarah could respond, the captain's voice came over the intercom announcing their departure. As the plane lifted off, Sarah felt the familiar sensation of leaving one world behind and entering another. Flying had become routine for her over the past few years, but she never quite got used to the feeling of being suspended between places, between identities. Up here, 30,000 feet above the ground, she could almost forget about the weight she carried. Jessica Chen moved through the cabin, checking on passengers and preparing for the beverage service. The flight was smooth, and most passengers had settled in with books, tablets, or work. But she found herself glancing toward row 14 more often than usual. There was something about the woman in the middle seat that seemed familiar, though Jessica couldn't place it. As she approached with the beverage cart, Jessica noticed that Sarah had pushed up the sleeves of her hoodie. The afternoon sun streaming through the window illuminated something on her forearm, what looked like the edge of a tattoo. Jessica had seen countless tattoos on passengers over the years, everything from decorative butterflies to elaborate sleeve designs. But this one was different. The partial glimpse she caught made her pause. "Something to drink?" Jessica asked, trying to get a better look without being obvious. "Just water." "Please," Sarah replied, not looking up from the magazine she was pretending to read. As Jessica handed her the plastic cup, she caught a clearer view of the tattoo. Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't just any tattoo. It was a specific design she recognized, one that held deep meaning in certain circles. The partial image showed what appeared to be a shield with stars, and below it numbers that looked like coordinates. Jessica had grown up in a military family. Her father had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, and her brother was currently deployed in the Middle East. She knew military insignia when she saw it, and this wasn't just any unit marker. This was something special, something that spoke to service and sacrifice at the highest level. But it was more than just the military connection that made Jessica's pulse quicken. There was something specific about this particular design that triggered a memory. She had seen it before, not in person, but in a news story that had stuck with her. A story about heroism in the face of impossible odds, about someone who had saved lives when everything went wrong. Sarah seemed completely unaware of Jessica's recognition. She sipped her water and continued reading, the picture of an ordinary passenger on an ordinary flight. But Jessica knew that appearances could be deceiving, especially when it came to the kind of people who wore that particular tattoo. The rest of the beverage service passed in a blur as Jessica tried to piece together her growing suspicion. She had to be careful not to stare, not to make Sarah uncomfortable, but the more she thought about it, the more certain she became that the woman in 14C was not who she appeared to be. She was someone whose story the world needed to know, someone whose quiet heroism had been hidden away for far too long. Jessica Chen couldn't shake the feeling that nagged at her as she continued down the aisle with the beverage cart. The tattoo on the woman in 14C was more than just military ink. It was a piece of history she had seen somewhere before. As she served other passengers, her mind raced through memories of news stories, documentaries, and conversations with her father about different military units and their special operations. The coordinates beneath the shield bothered her the most. They weren't random numbers. They meant something specific. Jessica had learned enough from her military family to know that coordinates on a tattoo usually marked a place of significant importance, either where someone served with distinction or where something life-changing happened. Meanwhile, Sarah tried to focus on her magazine, but she could feel the flight attendant's eyes on her. It wasn't unusual for people to stare sometimes. She had learned to live with a certain amount of attention from strangers. But this felt different, more focused, more knowing. She pulled her sleeves back down and adjusted her position in the cramped middle seat. Dorothy, the elderly woman beside her, had dozed off with her knitting in her lap. The businessman on the other side remained absorbed in his work, occasionally typing furiously on his laptop. Around them, the plane hummed with the quiet activity of a routine flight, passengers reading, watching downloaded movies, or catching up on sleep. But Jessica couldn't let it go. During her break, she retreated to the galley area and pulled out her phone. She scrolled through her photos until she found what she was looking for, a screenshot she had saved months ago from a news article her father had shared with her. It was about unsung heroes of recent conflicts, and one particular story had struck her so deeply that she had saved the image. There it was. The same shield design, the same star configuration. The article had been about a military intelligence specialist who had prevented a massive terrorist attack 3 years ago. The operation had been classified for months, and when details finally emerged, they revealed an act of extraordinary courage that had saved hundreds of lives. Jessica's hands trembled slightly as she read the cached article on her phone. The specialist had gone deep undercover for weeks, gathering intelligence about a planned attack on a major transportation hub. When the operation went wrong and her cover was blown, she had managed to get critical information to her team while under heavy fire. The attack was stopped just hours before it was set to begin. The hero's name had been redacted in most news reports for security reasons, referred to only as Agent M. But there had been one photograph, a distant shot of someone being escorted away from a building, too blurry to make out facial features clearly. What was clear, however, was the tattoo visible on the person's arm, a shield with specific military insignia and coordinates that marked the exact location where the operation had taken place. Jessica looked up from her phone toward row 14, where Sarah sat quietly reading. Could it really be her? The timeline matched. The article was from 3 years ago, and the woman appeared to be the right age. But more than that, there was something about Sarah's demeanor that fit. The way she observed her surroundings, the practiced anonymity, the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from her even in repose. As the flight continued, Jessica found herself paying closer attention to Sarah's behavior. When they hit a patch of turbulence, Sarah barely reacted. Her hands remained steady, her breathing unchanged. Most passengers gripped their armrests or looked nervous, but Sarah seemed completely unfazed by the aircraft's movements. It was the reaction of someone who had been in much more dangerous situations. During the snack service, Jessica approached row 14 again. This time she made a point of engaging Sarah in conversation. "How are you doing today? First time flying to Denver?" Sarah looked up, and for just a moment Jessica caught something in her eyes. A flash of wariness, quickly masked by polite disinterest. "No, I travel there fairly regularly for work," Sarah replied. "What kind of security consulting do you do?" Jessica asked, remembering Dorothy's earlier conversation with Sarah. Sarah's pause was almost imperceptible, but Jessica caught it. "Risk assessment mostly, helping organizations identify vulnerabilities in their security systems." It was a good answer. Professional, vague enough to discourage follow-up questions, but specific enough to sound credible. Jessica had heard similar responses from other passengers who worked in sensitive fields, but combined with everything else, it only strengthened her growing conviction. "That must be interesting work," Jessica said, offering Sarah a pack of pretzels. "Important too, keeping people safe." Something flickered across Sarah's face at those words. For just a moment, the carefully maintained mask slipped, and Jessica saw something deeper, a weight, a responsibility that went far beyond typical security consulting. "Someone has to do it," Sarah said quietly, then seemed to realize she had revealed more than intended. She quickly looked back down at her magazine. Jessica moved on to serve other passengers, but her mind was spinning. The more she observed Sarah, the more convinced she became. The tattoo, the military bearing, the careful way she spoke about her work, it all pointed to the same conclusion. The woman in seat 14C was Agent M, the unsung hero who had prevented a terrorist attack that could have claimed hundreds of lives. But why was she flying under what appeared to be her real name? Why wasn't she using an alias? Jessica had noticed the name S. Martinez on the passenger manifest. Either security protocols had relaxed, or Sarah felt safe enough to travel openly now. Or perhaps the secrecy was no longer necessary. As they approached the halfway point of the flight, Jessica made a decision. She couldn't just let this opportunity pass. This woman, if she was who Jessica thought she was, deserved recognition. She deserved to have her story told, to be acknowledged for the incredible sacrifice she had made. But she also knew she had to be careful. If Sarah was indeed a former intelligence operative, there were probably good reasons why she maintained such a low profile. Approaching her directly could be awkward, potentially even dangerous if there were still security concerns. Jessica decided to test her theory first. She walked back to row 14, ostensibly to check if anyone needed anything, but really to get one more look at that tattoo. This time she was ready with her phone, though she kept it discreet. "Excuse me," she said to Sarah. "The captain asked me to check that everyone's comfortable." "The flight's going smoothly, right?" Sarah nodded politely. "Everything's fine, thank you." As Sarah reached for her water bottle, her sleeve pulled up again, revealing more of the tattoo. Jessica's heart raced as she confirmed what she had suspected. The coordinates were clearly visible, and they matched exactly what she had seen in the news article. This was really happening. Agent M, the hero who had saved countless lives, was sitting in the middle seat of her airplane, traveling quietly to Denver like any other passenger. And Jessica was probably the only person on the entire flight who knew who she really was. Jessica's hands were shaking as she returned to the galley. She had to make a decision. Should she approach Sarah directly or maintain professional distance? The weight of recognition pressed heavily on her shoulders. This wasn't just any passenger. This was someone who had literally saved lives, someone whose courage had prevented a tragedy that could have changed the course of history. She looked at the time. They were still an hour away from Denver. If she was going to act on this knowledge, it had to be now. But how do you approach someone whose very identity might still be classified? How do you thank someone for heroism they've never been publicly acknowledged for? Jessica took a deep breath and made her choice. She prepared a small tray with fresh coffee and walked purposefully toward row 14. Her heart pounded as she approached, knowing this conversation could change everything for both of them. "Excuse me, miss," Jessica said softly, stopping beside Sarah's seat. "I wondered if I could speak with you for just a moment." Sarah looked up, immediately alert. There was something different in the flight attendant's voice, something that made her instinctively cautious. "Is there a problem?" "No, no problem at all," Jessica assured her quickly. "It's just, I think I recognize you. Or rather, I recognize what that tattoo represents. Sarah's entire body tensed. Her hand instinctively moved to cover her forearm, but it was too late. Jessica had already seen what she needed to see. The coordinates, the shield, the stars, all of it matched perfectly with the image she had saved on her phone. "I'm sorry. I think you have me confused with someone else," Sarah said carefully, her voice taking on a slightly harder edge. Jessica glanced around to make sure no other passengers were listening, then leaned in slightly. "Those coordinates," she whispered. "They're from Operation Sandstorm, aren't they? 3 years ago. The intelligence operation that stopped the attack on Union Station." The color drained from Sarah's face. For a moment, she looked like she might deny it again. But something in Jessica's expression, respect, admiration, not threat, made her pause. "My father served 3 tours in Afghanistan," Jessica continued quietly. "My brother is deployed right now. I know what military honors look like, and I know what that particular tattoo means." "You're Agent M." Sarah closed her eyes briefly as if weighing her options. When she opened them again, there was a resignation there that spoke of years of carrying secrets alone. "How did you—" Sarah began, then stopped herself. "You shouldn't know about that." "The story made news eventually," Jessica said gently. "Not your name, not your face, but the operation itself. My father shared an article about unsung heroes, and I saved it because it reminded me why his service mattered. When I saw your tattoo, I remembered. Dorothy, the elderly woman in the window seat, had woken up and was listening with growing interest. The businessman on the other side remained oblivious, still focused on his laptop. Sarah looked around nervously. "Please," she said quietly, "I can't. This isn't something I talk about." "I understand," Jessica said, "but I had to tell you what you did saved my cousin's life." Sarah's eyes widened in surprise. "What do you mean?" "My cousin Maria works at Union Station in Chicago," Jessica explained, her voice thick with emotion. "She was there that day, the day you stopped the attack. She would have been in the main terminal when—" Jessica paused, unable to finish the sentence. The truth hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had read the intelligence reports, knew the potential casualty numbers, but she rarely allowed herself to think about the actual people whose lives hung in the balance. It was easier to focus on the mission, the objectives, the tactical elements. Thinking about the faces, the families, the individual stories made the weight unbearable. "She doesn't even know how close she came," Jessica continued. "None of them do. They just went about their normal day because you made sure they could." Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her water. 3 years of therapy had helped her process the trauma of that operation, but she still struggled with the magnitude of what could have happened if she had failed. "I just did my job," Sarah said finally, the words sounding hollow even to her. "No," Jessica said firmly. "You did far more than that. According to the reports, you stayed behind when your extraction went wrong. You kept transmitting intelligence even while under fire. That's not just doing your job, that's heroism." Dorothy had been listening intently, and now she reached over to place a gentle hand on Sarah's arm. "Dear, is this true? Are you the person who saved all those people?" Sarah looked between the 2 women, feeling exposed and vulnerable in a way she hadn't experienced in years. She had gotten used to anonymity, to being just another face in the crowd. But here, 30,000 feet above the ground, her carefully constructed invisibility was crumbling. "It wasn't just me," Sarah said quietly. "There was a whole team. Intelligence analysts, tactical units, bomb disposal experts. I was just one piece of a much larger operation." "But you were the piece that made it possible," Jessica insisted. "Without the intelligence you gathered, without your sacrifice, none of the rest would have mattered." The word sacrifice hung in the air between them. Sarah touched her shoulder unconsciously, where scar tissue from that day still reminded her of the price she had paid. The physical wounds had healed, but the psychological ones ran deeper. "What happened to you after?" Dorothy asked gently. "I mean after the operation?" Sarah hesitated. She had never talked about this with strangers, had barely talked about it with the therapists and debriefers who were supposed to help her process it all. "I was in the hospital for a while," she said finally. "Then debriefing, psychological evaluation, reassignment. The whole thing was classified, so there was no recognition, no ceremony, no acknowledgement. Which was fine," she added quickly. "That's how these things work." But Jessica could hear the pain in her voice, the loneliness of carrying such a profound experience in silence. "That's not fine," she said. What you did should be celebrated. People should know. People can't know, Sarah replied. The methods we used, the sources we protected, there are still operational security concerns. Revealing too much could compromise ongoing operations, put other agents at risk. It was the practiced response of someone who had learned to prioritize the mission above personal recognition. But Jessica could see the cost of that choice written in the lines around Sarah's eyes, in the way she held herself apart from the world. Maybe people can't know the details, Jessica said, but they should know that heroes like you exist, that there are people willing to sacrifice everything to keep them safe. Sarah looked out the window at the clouds below, thinking about the life she had built since that day. A quiet life, a careful life, a life designed to help her forget what she had seen and done. But sitting here, being recognized for who she truly was, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The possibility that her sacrifice had meant something beyond just completing a mission. As the plane continued its journey toward Denver, Sarah found herself transported back to that day 3 years ago. The memories came flooding back with painful clarity, triggered by Jessica's recognition and the weight of finally having someone understand what she had been through. It had started 6 months earlier with intelligence chatter about a planned attack on American soil. The target was unclear, the timeline vague, but the threat was credible enough to launch a deep cover operation. Sarah, with her background in Middle Eastern languages and her ability to blend into different environments, was chosen to infiltrate the network planning the attack. The assignment took her to a small apartment in Detroit, where she posed as Elena Vasquez, a recent immigrant looking for work and community. For weeks, she attended the same mosque, shopped at the same markets, and slowly built relationships with people who might have connections to the terrorist cell. The work was painstaking and dangerous. Every conversation had to be carefully navigated. Every friendship she built was a lie that ate away at her conscience. She couldn't contact her handlers directly, instead using a complex system of coded messages and dead drops to pass along information. After 2 months undercover, she finally made contact with Rashid, a man who seemed to have connections to the planning cell. He was suspicious at first, but Sarah's cover story was solid and her language skills were perfect. Slowly, he began to trust her, and eventually he introduced her to others in the network. What she discovered was worse than anyone had anticipated. The planned attack wasn't just one bombing. It was a coordinated series of attacks designed to maximize casualties and create widespread panic. The primary target was Union Station in Chicago during the morning rush hour, when thousands of commuters would be moving through the terminal. But that wasn't all. Intelligence suggested secondary targets in New York and Los Angeles, timed to occur after emergency responders had been deployed to Chicago. The scale of destruction would have been unprecedented, potentially killing hundreds and wounding thousands more. Sarah had transmitted this information to her handlers, expecting an immediate response. Instead, she was told to maintain her cover and gather more specific details. They needed to know the exact timing, the types of explosives being used, and the identities of all the cell members. Without this information, authorities might stop one attack only to miss the others, so she stayed. For 3 more weeks, she attended planning meetings, helped scout locations, and even assisted with acquiring supplies, all while secretly documenting everything for her handlers. The psychological toll was enormous. She was helping plan attacks that could kill thousands, even though her ultimate goal was to prevent them. The night before the planned attack, everything went wrong. Someone in the cell had become suspicious of Sarah's questions and her recent arrival in their community. During what she thought was a final planning meeting, she walked into a trap. "You're not who you say you are," Rashid had said, his hand resting on a pistol. "We know you're American intelligence." Sarah's training kicked in. She maintained her cover story, insisted they were making a mistake, but she could see in their eyes that they didn't believe her. She was in immediate danger, but more importantly, the mission was compromised. If they killed her now, the attacks would proceed as planned and hundreds would die. The room had 5 men, all armed. Sarah was carrying a concealed pistol, but drawing it would be suicide. Instead, she did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She told them the truth. "You're right," she said calmly. "I am American intelligence. And I'm here because we know about Chicago, New York, and Los Angeles. The question is, do you want to die as martyrs or do you want to live to fight another day?" The honesty caught them off guard. Rashid's hand moved away from his weapon. "What are you talking about?" "Your communications have been compromised for weeks," Sarah lied smoothly. "We know about the targets, the timing, everything. But we also know this cell is just one part of a larger network. Help us stop this attack and we can work out a deal. Continue with it and you'll all be dead or in prison by tomorrow night." It was a desperate bluff, but it bought her time. As the men argued among themselves about what to do, Sarah managed to activate the emergency beacon hidden in her clothing. The signal would bring backup, but they were at least 20 minutes away. She had to survive that long and prevent the cell from scattering. What followed was the longest 20 minutes of her life. She used every psychological technique she had learned to keep the men talking, to plant seeds of doubt about their mission. She convinced them that authorities were already moving against the other cells, that their sacrifice would be meaningless. But just as backup was arriving, one of the younger members panicked. He started shooting and the room erupted in chaos. Sarah took 2 bullets, one in the shoulder, one that grazed her ribs, but she managed to return fire and hold her position until tactical teams stormed the building. 3 of the 5 cell members were killed in the firefight. Rashid and 1 other were captured alive and provided crucial intelligence that helped authorities round up the remaining network members in Chicago, New York, and Los Angeles. The coordinated attacks were prevented with just hours to spare. Sarah spent 6 weeks in the hospital, undergoing surgery to repair damage from the gunshot wounds. During her recovery, she learned that authorities had found enough explosives to level half of Union Station. The death toll could have reached into the hundreds, with thousands more injured, but there was no celebration, no medal ceremony, no public recognition. The operation remained classified to protect intelligence sources and methods. Sarah received a commendation that she was never allowed to see, and her file was sealed. To the world, the attack had been prevented through routine intelligence work. Her name never appeared in any report. The tattoo on her arm contained the coordinates of that apartment building in Detroit where she had nearly died. It was her way of remembering not just the mission, but the moment when she had chosen to risk everything for strangers she would never meet. Now, sitting on this airplane, being recognized for the first time in 3 years, Sarah felt the full weight of what she had carried alone. The nightmares, the guilt, the isolation. All of it had been endured in silence because that was what the job required. The hardest part, Sarah said quietly to Jessica and Dorothy, wasn't getting shot. It was coming home afterward and pretending it never happened. Watching the news, seeing stories about terrorism threats, and knowing that I had prevented something terrible but could never tell anyone. Jessica reached across the aisle and gently squeezed Sarah's hand. "You don't have to carry it alone anymore," she said. "At least not completely. Some of us know. Some of us understand what you did." For the first time in 3 years, Sarah felt like the weight on her shoulders had shifted. Just slightly. She wasn't alone with her secret anymore. Someone else knew, someone else understood, and somehow that made all the difference. The conversation had drawn the attention of several nearby passengers, though they couldn't hear the specific details. Dorothy had tears in her eyes as she looked at Sarah with newfound understanding. The businessman beside Sarah had finally looked up from his laptop, sensing the emotional weight of whatever was happening in row 14. "What do you do now?" Jessica asked gently. "I mean, after everything you went through, how do you move forward?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. "For the first year, I didn't handle it well," she admitted. "I had PTSD, survivor's guilt, depression. The agency provided counseling, but it was hard to talk about something I couldn't really discuss. Most therapists aren't cleared for classified information." She paused, remembering those dark months when she had barely been able to leave her apartment. "I kept thinking about all the people who didn't make it home that day because of my choices. 3 men died in that apartment. They were terrorists, they were planning to kill innocent people, but they were still someone's sons, someone's brothers. That weighs on you." Dorothy nodded knowingly. "My husband struggled with similar feelings after the war. He saved his unit during an ambush, but he lost 2 friends in the process. It took him years to understand that sometimes the cost of doing what's right includes carrying that weight forever." "Exactly," Sarah said. "But eventually I realized I had a choice. I could let the guilt destroy me, or I could find a way to honor the sacrifice by helping others. That's when I started my current work." "The security consulting?" Jessica asked. "It's more than that," Sarah explained. I work with organizations that help victims of terrorism and their families. Schools, community centers, transportation hubs. Places that need to feel safe again after an attack or threat. I help them improve their security, but more importantly, I help them heal. It was work that fulfilled her in ways that her intelligence career never had. Instead of operating in shadows and secrets, she was helping people rebuild their sense of safety and community. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was now protecting the very types of places she had once helped save from attack. I also work with other former intelligence operatives, Sarah continued. People who've had similar experiences but can't talk about them publicly. We have an informal support network, a way to process these experiences with people who understand. Jessica was amazed by this revelation. So there are others like you? Other people who've done incredible things but can't be recognized for them. More than you'd think, Sarah said. The intelligence community is full of people who've prevented attacks, saved lives, stopped international incidents. But because of the nature of the work, their stories can never be told. They come home to their families and neighborhoods as if nothing happened, carrying these enormous experiences in complete silence. The businessman beside Sarah had been listening more intently than he let on. Finally, he turned to face her. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I couldn't help overhearing. I'm Robert Chen, Jessica's uncle, actually. I work for the State Department." Jessica's eyes widened in surprise. She hadn't realized the passenger next to Sarah was her Uncle Robert, whom she rarely saw because of his travel schedule. "I've heard stories like yours in my work," Robert continued. "Not the details, but the broad strokes. The people who do what you did, who sacrifice everything for strangers they'll never meet. I wanted you to know that those of us in government who are aware of these operations, we know what it costs. We know what you gave up." Sarah looked at him with surprise. It was rare to meet someone outside of the intelligence community who understood the personal toll of classified operations. "The thing people don't realize," Robert said, "is that heroes like you don't just save lives in the moment. Your actions have ripple effects that last for years. The families who stayed intact, the children who grew up with their parents, the communities that didn't have to rebuild from devastation. Your sacrifice created thousands of small victories that no one will ever connect back to you." Sarah felt tears threatening for the first time in the conversation. She had never thought about her actions in those terms. The ongoing life that continued because of what she had prevented. "Jessica's cousin Maria," Dorothy said thoughtfully. "She went on to become a teacher, didn't she, dear?" Jessica nodded. "Elementary school. She teaches 3rd grade now. Has for 2 years. Think about that," Dorothy said to Sarah. "Because you did what you did, Maria was alive to become a teacher. How many children has she influenced? How many young minds has she shaped? And her future children, her future grandchildren. All of that exists because you made a split-second decision to risk everything." The magnitude of these ripple effects was overwhelming. Sarah had focused so much on the immediate aftermath of the operation, the bullets, the hospital, the psychological trauma, that she had never considered the long-term impact of the lives that continued. "I never thought about it that way," Sarah said softly. "That's because you're humble," Jessica said. "Real heroes don't spend time calculating their impact. They just do what's right and move on. But the rest of us get to live with the consequences of your choices, and in this case, those consequences are beautiful." Robert pulled out his phone and showed Sarah a photo. "This is my daughter's wedding last month. She works in federal security now, partly inspired by people like you. The venue was Union Station in D.C., different station, but it made me think about how many weddings, graduations, reunions, and celebrations happen every day in places like that because people like you keep them safe." Sarah stared at the photo. A young woman in a white dress, surrounded by family and friends all smiling at the camera. It was such an ordinary moment, yet it represented everything she had fought to protect. The simple right to gather, to celebrate, to live without fear. "I have something to confess," Dorothy said suddenly. "I didn't tell you the complete truth about my husband earlier. He wasn't just in law enforcement. He was FBI counterterrorism. He worked some of the cases related to your operation, though I'm sure he never knew your identity." Sarah's eyes widened. "Your husband worked on Sandstorm?" "The aftermath, yes," Dorothy said. "He spent months tracking down the remaining network connections, making sure no one else was planning similar attacks. He used to come home so frustrated because he knew there was someone, an agent, who had made it all possible, but he could never thank them. He would say, "Somewhere out there is a hero who saved hundreds of lives. And they'll never know how grateful I am." Dorothy reached into her purse and pulled out a small American flag pin, worn and faded. This was his. He carried it on every case for 30 years. He passed away last year, but before he died, he made me promise to give this to a real hero if I ever met one. She pressed the pin into Sarah's hand. "I think he would want you to have it." Sarah looked down at the simple pin in her palm, feeling the full weight of recognition she had never received. This wasn't an official commendation or a medal ceremony, but somehow it meant more than any formal recognition could have. It was a connection across time between two people who had devoted their lives to protecting others, one thanking the other through the hands of a widow on an airplane. Sarah stared at the flag pin in her palm, its small metal surface worn smooth by years of handling. The weight of it seemed disproportionate to its size, carrying with it the gratitude of Dorothy's late husband and all the people he had served alongside. For the first time since that day in Detroit, Sarah felt truly seen for who she was and what she had done. "I don't know what to say," Sarah whispered, closing her fingers around the pin. "You don't have to say anything," Dorothy replied gently. "Just know that there are people who understand the sacrifice you made. People who know that heroes aren't just the ones who get parades and medals. Sometimes they're the ones who disappear into crowds afterward, carrying their service quietly." The conversation had created an unexpected bubble of intimacy among the four passengers. Other travelers continued their journeys around them, unaware that they were sharing their flight with someone who had quite literally saved hundreds of lives. The normalcy of it struck Sarah as both ironic and beautiful. This was exactly the kind of ordinary moment she had fought to preserve. As the captain announced their descent into Denver, Jessica realized she had a decision to make. "Sarah," she said carefully, "I know this might be overstepping, but would you mind if I shared your story? Not publicly, not with your name or identifying details, but with my family, my father and brother especially. They would want to know that someone like you exists." Sarah considered this for a moment. For 3 years, she had guarded her story completely, sharing the details with no one outside of debriefings and therapy sessions. But sitting here, surrounded by people who understood and appreciated her service, the idea of selective sharing didn't feel as threatening as it once had. "I suppose it would be okay," she said slowly, "as long as you're careful about the details. No names, no specific dates or locations, just the general idea that these kinds of operations happen and that people are willing to take these risks." "Of course," Jessica assured her. "My father always wondered about the people behind the headlines, the ones who stop the attacks you never hear about. Knowing that someone like you is out there will give him hope." Robert had been quiet for several minutes, processing what he had learned. Finally, he spoke up. "Sarah, I want you to know that in my work, I occasionally interface with people in the intelligence community. Without betraying any confidences or revealing your identity, I'd like to make sure the right people know that this operation had lasting positive effects beyond just preventing the immediate attack. Sometimes that feedback matters for future operations and for the people making difficult decisions about resource allocation." So, was a diplomatic way of saying that Sarah's story would quietly make its way to people who could ensure that similar operations received proper support in the future. Not recognition in the traditional sense, but acknowledgement within the community that mattered. The plane touched down at Denver International Airport with its characteristic gentle bump. As passengers began reaching for their bags and preparing to disembark, Sarah felt a strange reluctance to leave. This conversation, this moment of recognition and understanding, had been the first time in years that she felt completely herself with other people. "I have a layover here for 3 hours," Jessica said as they gathered their belongings. "Would you like to have coffee? I mean, if you have time?" Sarah checked her phone. Her meeting wasn't until tomorrow morning and her hotel was near the airport. "I'd like that," she said, surprising herself. Dorothy was traveling with her church group who were waiting for her at the gate, but she hugged Sarah before leaving. "Thank you, dear," she whispered, "for everything you did, and for helping me fulfill my promise to my husband. He would have been so proud to meet you." As they walked through the terminal together, Robert pointed out something that made Sarah pause. "Look around," he said. "Really look at all these people." The terminal was bustling with typical airport activity. Families reuniting, business travelers rushing to connections, tourists starting their vacations, children laughing as they ran to greet grandparents, couples holding hands as they walked to their gates. The everyday humanity of it all was overwhelming when Sarah considered how different it might have been. 3 years ago, scenes like this might not have existed, Robert said quietly, not because the attacks would have destroyed every airport, but because the fear would have changed how we live. People would have been afraid to travel, to gather in large groups, to trust in their safety. You didn't just save lives that day, you preserved a way of life. At the coffee shop, Jessica showed Sarah photos on her phone of family gatherings, her brother's deployment pictures, her cousin Maria's classroom. Each image represented the ongoing life that continued because of choices made in a Detroit apartment years ago. "Can I ask you something?" Jessica said as they sipped their coffee. "Do you ever regret staying in that apartment? When your cover was blown, you could have tried to escape. You had transmitted enough intelligence to prevent the main attack." Sarah thought about this question, which had kept her awake many nights. "I think about it sometimes," she admitted. "But I knew that if I ran, they might have changed the plan, moved the attacks to different targets, different times. I had to stay to make sure we got everything. All the cell members, all the locations, all the explosives. The only way to be certain we prevented all of it was to see it through to the end, even knowing you might die." "Even knowing I might die," Sarah confirmed. "Because the alternative was knowing that hundreds definitely would." As their time together drew to a close, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a sense of closure. Not completion. The work of healing and moving forward would continue, but a feeling that this chapter of her life could finally be integrated with the rest of her story. Jessica gave her a business card with her personal number written on the back. "If you ever want to talk or if you need someone who knows your story, please call me. And if you're ever in Dallas, my father would love to meet you, not as Agent M, just as Sarah." That evening in her hotel room, Sarah looked at herself in the mirror and saw something different. The woman looking back at her was still scarred, still carrying the weight of difficult choices, but she was no longer carrying it entirely alone. 3 strangers on an airplane had seen her for who she truly was, and had chosen to honor rather than judge, to celebrate rather than pity. She pinned Dorothy's flag pin to her jacket and made a decision. Tomorrow, at her meeting with the victim support organization in Denver, she would share a little more of her own story. Not the classified details, but the human experience of serving others at great personal cost. Perhaps her journey toward healing could help others on their own paths. As she settled into bed, Sarah realized that Jessica had been right about one thing. She didn't have to carry her story alone anymore. Not completely. And somehow that made all the difference in the world. For the first time in 3 years, she fell asleep without nightmares. Dreaming instead of ordinary moments in busy terminals, of children in classrooms, of weddings in safe spaces, and of the quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing you made it all possible. The next morning, she woke up not as Agent M, not as the anonymous hero of a classified operation, but as Sarah Martinez, a woman who had served her country with extraordinary courage and was finally ready to let that service be part of who she was, rather than something she had to hide from the world.